Let me welcome Dr. Rachel Havrelock to our program. She is Associate Professor of English at the University of Illinois, Chicago, UIC. She is co-founder in 2014 and principal investigator for Freshwater Lab, a UIC-based consortium for humanities and social science research that examines issues related to water, energy, and natural resources in the Great Lakes region. Dr. Havrelock is the author of the books The River Jordan, The Myth of a Dividing Line, and The Joshua Generation, Israeli Occupation and the Bible. I have had the great good fortune to study with her at Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning in Chicago in courses on the Book of Ruth, the Book of Joshua, Women in the Bible, the Deuteronomistic history, and most recently, Jews, Judaism, the Earth, and Climate. Rachel, welcome to Shavuot, our Torah, and thank you for the generosity of your time, effort, and expertise. I'd like to divide our all too brief time into three topics. We will begin with some textual references to water, then women, then move to the project that you're involved in, and lastly, what the hope and vision for the future is. So it seems to me that the role of women in the text as it relates to water is especially pertinent. There is, of course, the story of Miriam leading women in song after crossing the Sea of Reeds, and the Midrashic story of the well of water that springs up whenever she's present with the people. In the book of Ruth, we find Naomi crossing not just borders, but the River Jordan due to famine, which implies a lack of water or drought. And then Naomi and Ruth returning, again, crossing the river. And then in the book of Joshua, the story of Achsa, who, the daughter of Caleb, she then returns to her father and asks for springs of water because you cannot live on land with no water. And that's a story that you highlighted in your book, The Joshua Generation. Could you speak to this theme of women and water in the text and the influence that these stories have had on you?
Thank you so much. Of course, it's absolutely true. All the associations that you shared between individual biblical characters and water, and of course, we know about the mikvah and these other ideas of mayim chayim, the importance of living water that runs through Jewish texts and traditions. But the woman and water who works with water, who has been most influential to me in these times of increased militarism, military engagement, even as we speak here today in Israel, Palestine. So I've really been looking to a certain figure, what woman can emerge from a scenario of war and present a counterexample of how to inhabit the same earth as your neighbors, who sometimes might be your enemies and sometimes your rivals. And that is, as you said, Achsa, the daughter of Caleb the Kenizzite, who appears about midpoint of the book of Joshua. As you said, I just published a book on Joshua. I spent a long time poring over that text and really thinking about the legacy of conquest and masculinity that is bound up in being in an army and militarism, and how those models of masculinity and militarism have been so elevated in contemporary Israel with some very deleterious effects, if I may say. So if this militaristic masculine image from the book of Joshua has been so influential in modern times, I looked specifically through the self-same book to find a female model. And what is striking about Achsa is that her voice is the first one that emerges after the battles of conquest. And she comes to her father and says, through conquest, you've given me uninhabitable land. So please give me a spring of water so that I can survive in this place. And I'm going to, for everyone, do a quick screen share just to show two images of Achsa and to contemplate her words for a moment. Okay, Jodi, what do you see? How does it look?
It looks good.
Okay, so here in Barry Moser's depiction of Achsa, you can see that she's a Black woman. And that artistic depiction doesn't come from nowhere because Achsa and her father Caleb are repeatedly marked in the book of Joshua and other texts as being Kenizzites of Judah. And that's a really striking title because the Kenizzites again and again are listed as being enemies. And yet, the two identities of being a Kenizzite, an outsider, and a Judean coexist in Achsa. So I don't think it's in any way incidental that this woman with what today we would call intersectional identities is the one who is the advocate for allocating water in a way that is fair and equitable and makes the place where you live habitable. So here's a very different artistic depiction of Achsa, as a supplicant to her father. And this quality has been celebrated in Western art. But I think the really important model that Achsa provides to us is the importance of women's voices, because throughout religious and spiritual traditions, this bond between women and water, I have learned from women indigenous teachers that women carry the water. Men are in charge of the fire and women carry the water, and that has really spoken to me as a Jew. And here, to me, Achsa is this ancestor who will raise her voice before those even more powerful than her to speak about the need for a just distribution of water. Because if one neighbor overuses and leaves the other with drying fields, that damage is not going to be restricted to your neighbor's land. It's something that you are both, it's a disaster and a woe that both people would share.
Such a fascinating way to bring the text current, right? So your initiative of Freshwater Lab was affected by work done by the organization EcoPeace Mideast. And the latter has on its website the following quote: "Water can be a source of either conflict or collaboration." So for collaboration, it necessarily, it seems, entails seeing beyond borders where water is concerned in particular. So I'd like you, please, if you could, to elaborate on that idea and explain the concepts that are involved in not viewing physical borders that we might see on a map, but the borders that are created by water sources, watersheds, by the concept of bioregionalism, and then also expand on the work that you are doing.
Okay, thanks again for that. My life really changed when I found the NGO EcoPeace Middle East, which brings together Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian leaders, as well as residents who share the same source of water. And this is a very tangible, material way to understand this kind of interconnection. There's a nice kind of interconnection.
Sorry.
No, beautiful. The kind of interconnection that water fosters, whether we're aware of it or not. And in that sense, they bring together elected officials, mayors, educators, artists, and maybe really importantly, most importantly, youth who share the same source of water. And they commission scientists from all of the communities to undertake scientific research and to build up shared knowledge among all the people who share a singular water source, to build that up together. So rather than one group coming and saying, we've got the answer and this is how you build and we're going to save you, instead learning together. And after that process of learning together about one's water, advocating and raising money and taking actions to support that watershed and the collective good. And one way in which I can make this example really clear, I'm going to pull up another slide that is informed by EcoPeace's research, but also a lot of my own thinking about some of the short-sightedness of current water policy. So, oops, the map, I went ahead a little bit, hang on. This is the map that I wanted to share. So here we see a place that, as we conduct this interview, is both under siege and firing back, the Gaza Strip. And it's a different way to look at the Gaza Strip as one of the southernmost communities on Israel's and Egypt's coastal aquifer. And so the interesting thing about, or the really alarming piece about this part of the coastal aquifer is that the portion of the aquifer under Gaza has collapsed. 2020 was the last year of its viability. So that means that the major drinking water source for the people in Gaza is unpotable, disease-carrying water. And so one might say, well, Gaza hosts radical groups, is in a hostile position towards the state of Israel. You know, why should Israel be invested or care if they have insufficient wastewater treatment or water insecurity? Well, again, if we look at the watershed level, the answer becomes very obvious. Here's a map in the left-hand corner, a graphic created by EcoPeace that dramatizes the amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen sewage-laden water that pours from the Gaza Strip each day because of restrictions on equipment, on energy, on drinking water infrastructure. And yet, poised right on the same aquifer are the world-renowned desalination plants of Israel. The oldest one in Ashkelon, a very large one in Palmachim, and a huge complex that is growing as we speak, Sorek water desalination plant that serves the Tel Aviv area. So here you can see that the pollution of enemies feeds in to, or so-called enemies, feeds in to Israel's major drinking water source, right? Right now, desalination is the number one, the major source of drinking water in Israel, and yet each and every day, it too is being polluted by the untreated sewage in Gaza. So there isn't a solution to climate change and desertification and water insecurity in Israel. Desalination, of course, has to be part of the solution to rising temperatures in the Middle East. And yet, as that drinking water is produced, it is imperiled every day. So this goes to show that there must be an integrated solution to sourcing water, to producing food, and to inhabiting the same watershed, no matter the historic and ongoing military conflict.
So the notion of a watershed, if you could just expand on that a little bit for everybody listening, is, as I understand it, that we share a set of boundaries that if we define them by water and its location, we are sharing that watershed. Is that right? Is that a good way to look at it?
It's beautifully phrased, and a way to recapitulate your clear explanation is that a watershed has its boundaries defined by the rain. Because when rain falls to earth, it follows certain drainage patterns. across soil into creeks and rivers and lakes. And that flow is an interconnected ecosystem, wherein the way that water moves across a landscape really creates much of its physical characteristics. And so watershed thinking or bioregional thinking understands that one important unit of our identification and shared interests are with those people who drink the same water that we drink. Because if someone is polluting it in one city, it is causing public health crises and problems everywhere. If it is harming the economy of one part of the watershed, we're all going to feel those reverberations. If you're killing off forests and species and prairie and other parts of the watershed, right, that is going to increase temperatures and cause other climate-related problems. So the watershed, also the watershed approach, also known as bioregionalism, looks to try to overcome. I mean, I think it's particularly pertinent now because it tries to overcome a lot of this partisan bickering of just thinking there's very little to fight about tax incentives if a water source that serves millions and millions of people is no longer potable. I mean, everyone dies, nothing survives in that scenario. So this is a way of thinking at a time of really rampant pollution. This watershed thinking is just a way to put a lot of the bloviating and the bickering and the bitterness, really, of politics that I've experienced in Israel and in the United States aside, and to think collectively. We're lucky in the Great Lakes region. There are good models to be found in the way that the US and Canada have managed the shared boundary waters like our own magnificent Great Lakes. So there's a really good history. It's not sufficient and there is a long way to go. But especially we in this freshwater, full region, we have a lot to offer the world amidst climate change with this water. However, just as in the case of Israel and Gaza, we too have scars of segregation, of systemic racism,
Sure.
of handouts to industry, followed by deindustrialization without cleanup. So we, as I've learned in my own freshwater lab at UIC, as I've learned in these past years, we have a lot of similar healing to do around here, although, not quite war and not scarcity at all. But, there's a lot of social healing and progress and innovation that can come from adopting this watershed approach.
It certainly is a different way of thinking. And I think that as more of us can embrace that, it leads me at least to think that we can be optimistic about the future. I mean, here in Chicago, we have the magnificent Lake Michigan, and yet we know all too well about the steel industry as it curves around and gets toward Gary, Indiana, and and into Indiana out of Illinois. Very different approach to being on the water, right?
I mean, yeah, if we're going to be frank about Indiana, their environmental standards on Lake Michigan are so very low and so unenforced that, that is a place where a watershed approach could have a lot of leverage and in turn could really strengthen the parts of our economy that are future oriented, that really can thrive with fresh water. So we should not continue to let the few steel mills that remain, as well as the Whiting BP tar sands refinery in Whiting, Indiana, that's part of this whole destructive pipeline system that Great Lakes indigenous people are fighting with all that they've got to save these lakes that are their relatives, that they see as a mother.
We could talk all evening about this, and I wish that we could. but our time sadly is very short and is coming to an end. And so are you optimistic then that water can be a source of collaboration? And along that vein, what could those listening to our conversation, how might they get involved?
Okay, thank you so much. If I may do my final screen share and offer this as a resource to anyone who is interested. This is one of the Freshwater Lab's digital media projects called freshwaterstories.com, and it tries to take these watershed theories and these visions for our region and the Great Lakes to really make them to visualize them and make them available to people living across Lake Michigan. So we introduce the lake. This is your lake, your water, your future, and it needs you. And it thinks about how a single drop of water is in our food, our energy, it influences our health, and it can foster community. And we focus here on Lake Michigan. And here's a great example of this kind of watershed cartography of looking at the lake from an angle that we are not used to in order to really think about it as a body of water instead of some kind of social boundary. So there's a lot we can be doing for Lake Michigan, and I am so pleased to share that it seems to be a really good time to be doing this. I just can't celebrate enough that the EPA is back. The EPA, these changes are being felt in watersheds across the country. So everyone listening, become a friend to the EPA. We need science, we need regulation, we need expertise, and we need people, and we need funding to guide us through this era of climate change. So that's very profound. But there are drinking water bills, affordable drinking water bills, moving legislation that's moving at the federal, state, city, and local level. So please, learn about water affordability campaigns, water equity campaigns, and also get behind the infrastructure bill. We've got the world's best water in this part of the world. We've got failing infrastructure. We've got infrastructure that is serving private industry more than it's serving residents and the future generation. So, bring the infrastructure, bring the scientists, and really bring devotion and new thinking to what the Great Lakes region can be as other parts of the country and the world literally go dry.
Rachel, thank you so much for being a part of our program, for so much insight, for sharing your expertise, again, your generosity of time, and the opportunity personally that I get to chit chat with you yet one more time on such important issues. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's a great, great pleasure. And again, Shavuot Sameach to everyone.